Anyone but the human, swore the alien princess until fate intervened. The crystal halls of Aethera Prime had never looked more beautiful than they did on this sacred night of choosing. And Princess Valari stood at the center of it all, her silver gown catching the light of 1,000 floating lanterns that drifted through the air like captured stars. She was the third daughter of Emperor Thalvex, ruler of one of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy. And tonight the court had gathered to witness the presentation of her potential suitors from across the stars. Valari kept her face calm and regal as she watched the great doors of the throne room open again and again, each time revealing another candidate who had traveled light years for the honor of her consideration. The Vexery Prince came first, his forearms spread wide in greeting, his scales shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of his noble bloodline and his people's mastery of deep space navigation. Then came the delegate from the Crystalline Consortium, a being of living gemstone whose every movement created music, whose very existence was a testament to millions of years of evolution. Beyond flesh and bone, Valari acknowledged each with a graceful nod, her psionic senses reaching out to taste their intentions, their ambitions, their worthiness to stand beside an Aetheran princess. Her people had walked among the stars when most species were still learning to make fire, and she carried that legacy in every gesture, every thought, every carefully measured breath. The Galactic Council's chief ambassador, an elderly Vexery named Torvax, stepped forward with a scroll in his upper hands and cleared his throat in that particular way that always meant trouble was coming. "Your Imperial Highness," he announced, his voice carrying through the vast chamber, "the Council presents one final candidate for your consideration, offered in the spirit of unity and the strengthening of bonds between all member species." The doors opened once more, and Valari felt her mother stiffen beside her on the raised platform where the royal family sat in Judgment Day. Human walked through the doorway. He was tall for his kind, with black hair and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. And he wore the simple formal uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, rather than the elaborate costumes of the other suitors. His name, according to the herald who announced him, was Kang De-Wan, and he served as one of humanity's senior ambassadors to the Galactic Council. Valari felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched him approach the throne with measured steps, his posture straight but not stiff, his expression respectful but not subservient. Humans had only been part of galactic civilization for less than 200 years, barely a heartbeat in the long history of the Aetheran Empire, and yet here one stood, presented as a potential match for a princess whose ancestors had shaped the very laws that governed interstellar society. She rose from her seat before he could even offer his formal greeting, and she heard her sister Sire draw a sharp breath beside her. "No," Valari said, and her voice rang through the crystal hall like a struck bell, silencing every whisper and stopping every movement. The human paused mid-step, his dark eyes meeting hers without flinching, and she felt a flash of irritation that he did not look away as proper etiquette demanded. "I will not consider this candidate," she continued, her words falling like stones into still water. "The Aetheran Empire honors humanity's recent acceptance into galactic society, but we cannot pretend that a species barely past its infancy is a suitable match for the bloodline of Thalvex." She saw several council members exchange uncomfortable glances, but she pressed on, her pride carrying her forward like a ship in a storm. "Humans live barely a century," she declared. "They possess no psionic abilities, no connection to the deeper currents of existence that define true civilization, and their history is a catalog of violence against their own kind that should give any rational being pause." The human ambassador simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back. And the strangest part was that he did not argue or protest or defend himself as every other rejected suitor before him had done. He simply bowed his head slightly and said, "I thank the princess for her candor and wish her happiness in her eventual choice." Then he turned and walked back toward the doors without another word. And something about the quiet dignity of his retreat made Valari feel a twinge of something she refused to name. Later that night, after the ceremony had ended and the court had dispersed to gossip about the evening's drama, Crown Princess Sire found her younger sister standing alone on one of the palace's many balconies. "That was unnecessary," Sire said softly, coming to stand beside her. "The humans may be young, but they are not to be underestimated, and you may have made enemies where you could have made friends." Valari turned to face her sister, her silver eyes flashing with defiance. "I spoke only the truth," she insisted. "Would you have me pretend that a creature who will be dust before I reach middle age is worthy of standing beside me?" Sira's expression was troubled as she gazed out at the star-filled sky. "I have read the classified reports about their homeworld," she said quietly. "Earth is what the scientists call a death world. A planet of earthquakes and hurricanes and predators and diseases that would kill most species in a single generation. And yet humans did not merely survive there. They conquered it." She turned to look at Valari with eyes that held a warning. "Do not mistake brevity for weakness, sister, for the flame that burns half as long often burns twice as bright." Valari dismissed her sister's concerns with a wave of her hand. But as she returned to her chambers that night, she could not shake the memory of those dark human eyes meeting hers without fear. In the shadows of the palace gardens below, figures moved in the darkness, communicating in whispers and coded signals. "The summit proceeds as planned," one of them reported into a hidden communicator. "The royal family suspects nothing." "Excellent," came the reply from the void of space. "Begin the operation at the night festival and leave no survivors." The stars above Ithera Prime continued to shine, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to the doom that was coming for the Crystal Kingdom. 4 days they traveled through the tunnels and across the wild lands of Ithera Prime, and with each passing hour, Valari felt another piece of her certainty crumble away. The princess who had never walked more than a few steps without servants attending her now stumbled over rocky terrain with blistered feet, her once beautiful gown torn and stained, her silver hair matted with dirt and sweat. And always the human walked beside her, patient and watchful, never once complaining about the wound in his side that she knew must cause him constant pain. "You need to eat," Day One said on the morning of their 3rd day above ground, offering her a portion of the emergency rations he had somehow produced from his diplomatic kit. Valari took the food without argument, too exhausted for pride, and watched as he ate his own portion slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. "How do you do this?" she asked, her voice hoarse from thirst and fatigue. "How do you keep moving when you must be in so much pain?" The human considered her question for a long moment before answering. "On Earth, there is a bird called the Arctic tern," he said. "Every year it flies from one end of our planet to the other and back again, a journey of nearly 50,000 kilometers, and it does this for its entire life, which can span 30 years. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement in his dark eyes. "When asked why we endure, humans often do not have a good answer," he continued. "We simply do, because the alternative is to stop, and stopping means death." Valari thought about this as they continued their journey, pushing through dense vegetation that scratched her arms and climbing hills that made her legs burn with exhaustion. She had always believed that the Etherans were the superior species, gifted with psionic abilities and long lifespans that allowed them to master the stars while younger races were still discovering fire. But out here, stripped of her powers by the lingering effects of the dampening technology, she was the weak one, the burden that slowed them down, and the human was the one who kept them alive. "Tell me more about your world," she said that evening as they sheltered in a small cave. the sound of rain drumming against the stone outside. I want to understand. Day one sat with his back against the cave wall, his injured side carefully bandaged with strips torn from his own uniform, and he spoke of Earth in a voice that carried both love and sorrow. He told her about mountains so tall that climbers died trying to reach their peaks, yet humans kept climbing anyway, driven by something they could not name. He described oceans that had swallowed entire fleets, storms that had leveled cities, diseases that had killed billions. And through it all, humanity had survived and rebuilt and reached for the stars. We are not strong like the Krathians, he admitted. We are not wise like the Vetri, and we do not have the gifts of your people. But we have one thing that has carried us through every disaster, every war, every extinction-level event that should have ended our species. What is that? Valari asked, genuinely curious now. We refuse to give up, he said simply. Even when logic says we should, even when the odds are impossible, we keep fighting, keep hoping, keep moving forward, because that is what humans do. Valari lay awake long after the human had fallen into a light sleep, thinking about a species that measured its existence in decades, rather than centuries, yet had somehow crossed the void between stars through sheer stubborn determination. Perhaps, she thought, there were different kinds of strength, and she had been too blind to see the one that mattered most on the fifth day. They were ambushed. The Void Covenant scouts emerged from the trees without warning, 6 of them with weapons raised, and their leader smiled when he saw the state of their targets. The princess and her human pet. He sneered. The Covenant will reward us well for this. The one moved before the scout finished speaking, his body a blur of motion that caught the attackers off guard, and within seconds, 2 of them were down. But the human was weakened from days of travel and a wound that had never properly healed, and the remaining scouts quickly surrounded him, their weapons trained on his chest. Stop! Valari screamed, and to her own amazement, she threw herself between Day One and the attackers. Her arms spread wide. The scouts hesitated, clearly not expecting the princess to defend a human, and in that moment of confusion, she felt something break open inside her. You will not touch him, she declared, her voice carrying a strength she did not know she possessed. This man has protected me when my own people could not, has bled for me when he owed me nothing, and I will not stand by and watch him die. She did not know where the courage came from, did not understand the fire that suddenly burned in her chest, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die than let these monsters kill. The human who had shown her what true nobility looked like, the lead scout raised his weapon toward her face. And Valari did not flinch behind her. She heard Day One whisper something in his own language, and though she did not understand the words, she heard the surprise in his voice, and the scout's chest exploded in a burst of energy, and more figures emerged from the forest. Loyalist soldiers bearing the colors of the crown, led by a face Valari had never been so happy to see. Sister, Crown Princess Sire called out, cutting down another scout with a psionic blade. It seems you have had quite an adventure. The battle was over in moments. The remaining Covenant scouts quickly overwhelmed, and Valari turned to find Day One watching her with an expression she could not read. You stood in front of me, he said quietly, almost wonderingly. You were willing to die for a human. Valari met his eyes and felt something shift between them. Something that had been building since the first night in the tunnels. You were willing to die for me first, she replied. I was simply returning the favor. And as her sister's soldiers escorted them toward the Loyalist safe house, Valari walked beside the human, their shoulders almost touching, and neither of them pulled away. 3 nights after the ceremony of choosing, the palace gardens blazed with the lights of the night festival, and Princess Valari walked among the flowering trees with her handmaidens, trying to forget the uncomfortable memory of the human ambassador's quiet departure. The air was sweet with the scent of ether and moon blossoms. and musicians played soft melodies on instruments of crystal and light while nobles danced and laughed and pretended that the galaxy was at peace. Valari had almost convinced herself to enjoy the evening when the first explosion ripped through the eastern wing of the palace. She spun toward the sound, her psionic senses reaching out instinctively, and she felt something she had never experienced before. Nothing. A void where the minds of her guards and servants should have been. What is happening? One of her handmaidens screamed, but before Valari could answer, figures in black armor emerged from the shadows, their weapons already firing. The attackers moved with terrible precision, cutting down guards and civilians alike. And Valari recognized the symbol on their chest plates with a surge of ice-cold fear: the Void Covenant. The terrorist faction that had sworn to destroy the royal family and remake the Etherean Empire in their own image had finally made their move. She tried to reach out with her psionic abilities to push back the assassins or call for help, but her power slipped away like water through her fingers, blocked by some technology she had never encountered. Psionic dampeners, she realized with horror. And suddenly, she understood how helpless her people truly were without the mental gifts that had defined their civilization for millennia. Her handmaidens scattered as more attackers emerged from the garden paths, and Valari ran, her ceremonial gown tangling around her legs, her heart pounding with a fear she had never known. She ducked through an archway and down a narrow path between tall hedges, her breath coming in gasps, and then 3 figures stepped out to block her way. Assassins raised their weapons, and the leader smiled behind his mask. "The third princess," he said with satisfaction. "Our employers will pay well for your head." Valari backed away, searching desperately for an escape route. But high walls surrounded her on 3 sides, and the killers blocked the only way out. "This is how I die," she thought, and she wished with sudden desperation that she had been kinder, braver, better. Then a shadow dropped from the top of the garden wall, and everything changed. The human ambassador landed between Valari and the assassins with an impact that should have shattered his legs. But he simply rolled forward and came up moving. He grabbed the first attacker's weapon arm and twisted, and the crack of breaking bone was followed by a scream that cut off. When the human drove his elbow into the assassin's throat, the second attacker fired. But the human was no longer there, having moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a species without psionic enhancement. And then he was inside the assassin's guard, using the body of the first attacker as a shield. Valari watched in stunned disbelief as Kang Day 1 fought like something out of a nightmare, all brutal efficiency and controlled violence, his hands and feet striking with devastating precision. The third assassin managed to land a hit, his blade cutting a deep gash across the human side. But Day 1 simply grabbed the attacker's head and slammed it into the garden wall with enough force to crack stone in less than 30 seconds. All 3 assassins lay dead or dying, and the human stood among them breathing hard, his diplomatic uniform torn and soaked with blood, both his own and not. "Are you injured, Your Highness?" he asked, and his voice was calm, as if he had not just killed 3 trained soldiers with his bare hands. Valari could not find words, could only stare at this creature she had dismissed as inferior, this being from a death world who had just saved her life in ways her own people could not. "We need to move," he continued, pressing a hand against the wound in his side. "There will be more of them, and the palace is compromised." He led her through the gardens with sure steps, somehow knowing which paths were clear and which were not. And when they reached a hidden door in the outer wall, he produced a small device that unlocked it without hesitation. "How do you know about this?" Valari finally managed to ask as they descended into an ancient tunnel beneath the palace. "I read the historical surveys before the summit," he replied. "These tunnels were built during the Third Succession War as an escape route for the royal family." He stumbled slightly, and she saw that blood was still flowing from his wound, dripping onto the stone floor and leaving a trail behind them. "You are hurt," she said, reaching toward him without thinking. "You need medical attention. Later," he said firmly. "Right now, we need to put distance between us and the palace, and I need to get you somewhere safe." They walked in silence through the darkness, the only light coming from a small device the human carried. And Valari's mind raced with questions she did not know how to ask finally. When they stopped to rest in a small chamber where underground streams provided fresh water, she could contain her confusion no longer. "Why?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the ancient stones. "Why did you save me after what I said to you, after how I treated you before the entire court?" The human looked at her with those dark eyes that had haunted her thoughts for 3 days. And his answer was simple. "You needed help," he said. That was enough. He turned away to examine the tunnels ahead, leaving Valari to grapple with the realization that everything she thought she knew about humans might have been terribly, dangerously wrong. Above them, the palace burned. And somewhere in the chaos, the Void Covenant searched for the princess who had escaped their trap, but in the darkness beneath the world, a human continued forward despite his wounds, protecting someone who had offered him nothing but contempt. And Valari felt the first cracks forming in the wall of her pride. The Loyalist's safe house was a fortress hidden deep in the northern mountains, carved into the living rock by ancestors who had prepared for exactly this kind of catastrophe. And Valari had never been so grateful for their paranoid foresight. Medical drones attended to Day One's wounds, while Valari bathed and changed into simple soldier's clothing. And when she emerged from her quarters, she found her sister waiting for her with a grave expression. "The situation is worse than we feared," Sire said, leading her to a war room where holographic displays showed the current state of the Empire. "The Void Covenant has seized the palace and taken Father hostage, and they have allies we did not expect." The display shifted to show massive warships entering the Etherin system, their hulls marked with the jagged symbol of the hegemony of Krath. "The Krathians?" Valari whispered, her blood running cold at the sight of the warrior species that had nearly conquered the Empire centuries ago. "How is this possible?" "Someone on the inside has been feeding them information for years," Sire replied, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Someone with access to our defenses, our fleet movements, our most closely guarded secrets." She touched the display, and new information appeared. Intercepted communications, financial records, a trail of evidence that led to a conclusion Valari could not bring herself to accept. "Uncle Maven," she breathed, staring at the image of her father's own brother, a man who had bounced her on his knee as a child and told her stories of ancient. Urasiri nodded grimly. "He believes our people have grown weak and soft, that we need the Krathians to make us strong again," she explained. "He has been working with the Void Covenant and the hegemony for nearly a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." The generals gathered in the war room argued about strategy, their voices rising in heated debate about fleet movements and defensive positions. But all their plans required one thing they did not have: time. The Krathian fleet would reach Ethera Prime in 3 days. And once they arrived, any hope of rescuing the Emperor would vanish like morning mist. "We need to strike before they arrive," Valari said. And the generals turned to look at her with varying degrees of surprise and skepticism. "With respect, Your Highness," the senior general replied, his tone suggesting very little actual respect. "The palace is a fortress, protected by energy shields and filled with Covenant soldiers. And any frontal assault would cost us half our remaining forces." "Then do not make a frontal assault," a new voice said. And everyone turned to see Day One standing in the doorway, his wounds bandaged but his eyes sharp and alert. The generals exchanged glances of barely concealed contempt, but Valari gestured for him to continue. The Covenant expects a military response, Day One said, moving to the holographic display with the easy confidence of someone who had studied battlefields before. They have fortified against exactly what you are planning, but they have not prepared for something smaller, faster, unexpected. He manipulated the display to show the palace's interior layout. A small strike team, no more than a dozen warriors, could infiltrate through the old tunnels I used to escape with the princess, he explained. While the Covenant watches the skies for your fleet, we go in from below and extract the Emperor before they realize what is happening. The senior general laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. A human tactic, he sneered. Suitable perhaps for the primitive conflicts of your species, but hardly appropriate for civilized warfare. Valari felt anger surge through her, hot and unfamiliar, and she stepped forward before she could think better of it. This human, she said, her voice cutting through the dismissive murmurs, killed 3 Covenant assassins with his bare hands while your civilized forces were falling to psionic dampeners. And he kept me alive for 5 days in the wilderness while your civilized strategies failed to prevent a coup in our own palace. The war room fell silent, and she felt Day One's eyes on her, surprised and perhaps grateful. I have seen what humans are capable of, Valari continued, meeting the general's gaze without flinching. I have walked beside one through fire and blood, and I am telling you now that if this man says his plan can work, then I believe him. She turned to her sister, who watched her with an unreadable expression. I will go with the strike team, Valari declared. I know the palace better than any soldier, and my presence may convince guards loyal to our father to stand down rather than fight. This is madness, the general protested. But Sire raised a hand to silence him. My sister has changed, the crown princess said slowly, studying Valari as if seeing her for the first time. Perhaps we should listen to what has changed her later. After the plans were made and the team was assembled, Valari found Day One alone on a balcony overlooking the mountain valley, his bandaged form silhouetted against the setting sun. You defended me, he said without turning around. Again, you have earned my defense, she replied, moving to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. And I owe you an apology. He looked at her then, his dark eyes holding questions he was too polite to ask. I was wrong about you, Valari said, the words coming easier than she had expected. I was wrong about your species, and I said cruel things that you did not deserve. And I am sorry. Day One was quiet for a long moment, then he smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost beautiful. My grandmother used to say that wisdom is not knowing all the answers, he said softly. It is having the courage to admit when you were wrong. Valari felt her heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear or anger. And she wondered if this was what the poets meant when they wrote about finding unexpected treasure in unlikely places. Tomorrow we may die trying to save my father, she said. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I am grateful that fate brought you to me. Even if I did not recognize the gift at first. Day One reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against her smooth skin. Tomorrow, we will not die, he said with the quiet certainty that she had come to recognize as the human refusal to accept defeat. Tomorrow, we will save your father, and then we will see what other gifts fate has in store. They stood together as the sun sank below the mountains. Two souls from different worlds finding common ground in the darkness. And for the first time since the night of blood and fire, Valari felt hope. The strike team entered the tunnels beneath the palace in the darkest hour before dawn. 12 warriors moving in silence through passages that had not seen light in Centaurius. Valari walked beside Day One, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. And she drew strength from his steady presence as they climbed ever closer to the throne room where her father was being held. The Tunnels ended at a hidden door behind the great tapestry of the first emperor. And Day One held up a hand for silence as he listened at the entrance. 6 guards in the throne room, he whispered. Plus at least a dozen more in the corridors beyond. And I can hear 2 heavy footsteps that do not sound Etheran Krathian soldiers. Valari realized. The elite warriors of the hegemony sent to ensure the coup succeeded A1 gave silent commands to the strike team, dividing them into groups with hand signals that Valari had learned during their planning sessions. And then they moved the hidden door swung open without sound, and the team poured into the throne room like shadows given form. Taking down the guards before they could raise an alarm, Valari saw her father bound to his own throne, his face pale but his eyes still defiant. And beside him stood Lord Maven, her uncle, the traitor who had sold his own family for power. Valari? Her father gasped, hope and fear warring in his ancient eyes. How? Seize them! Maven shouted, and more soldiers flooded into the throne room from every entrance, surrounding the strike team with weapons drawn. But it was the figure that stepped through the main doors that made Valari's blood freeze in her veins. The Krathian champion stood nearly 8 feet tall, his gray skin covered in ritual scars, his forearms each holding a weapon that could cut through stone. And he smiled with teeth filed to points as he surveyed the trapped Etherans. The princess returns, he rumbled, his voice like grinding boulders. My masters will be pleased to add another royal head to their collection. The one stepped forward, placing himself between the champion and Valari, and the Krathian laughed. A human? He mocked. You send a human to face me? Your species is barely worth the effort of killing, little creature, and I have crushed hundreds of your kind beneath my feet. Then you know we do not stay down easily, Day One replied, his voice calm despite the impossible odds. The champion attacked without warning, all 4 arms moving in a blur of deadly steel, and Day One somehow ducked beneath the strikes, rolling across the floor and coming up with a weapon taken from a fallen guard. What followed was a battle that Valari knew she would remember until her dying day. The Krathian was stronger, faster, armed with centuries of training and forelimbs to Day One's too. And yet the human would not fall. Every time the champion struck him down, Day One rose again, bleeding from a dozen wounds but still fighting, still moving, still refusing to accept defeat. Why will you not die? The Krathian roared in frustration, his attacks growing wild as the human continued to evade and counter. Because she is behind me, Day One answered through gritted teeth. And I will not let you reach her. He ducked under a massive swing and drove his blade up into the gap between the champion's armor plates, twisting as he fell back, and the Krathian staggered with a howl of pain again and again. Day One attacked, targeting the same wound, wearing down the giant through persistence and determination and the absolute refusal to surrender that defined his species. Finally, the champion fell to his knees, his weapon slipping from weakened fingers, and Day One stood over him, swaying with exhaustion but still on his feet. Impossible, the Krathian whispered, staring up at the human who had defeated him. You are just a human. Yes, Day One agreed. I am. Valari did not waste the moment her champion had created. She strode across the throne room toward her uncle, who backed away with fear finally breaking through his mask of superiority. And she spoke not to him but to the soldiers who still surrounded them. You wear the colors of my father's house, she called out, a voice ringing with authority she had not known she possessed. You swore oaths to protect the royal family, to defend the empire against all enemies. And yet, you stand beside a traitor who has sold us to the very species that nearly destroyed U.S. centuries ago. She pointed at Maven, who was trying to slip away toward a side door. This man murdered your brothers and sisters in the palace guard, she continued. He invited our ancient enemies into our home. And he put your emperor in chains. And for what? For power he was too weak to earn. for a throne he could never deserve. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their weapons wavering. "I am Princess Valari of the House of Thalvex," she declared. "And I am asking you to remember your honor, to remember your oaths, and to stand with your true rulers against the darkness that threatens to consume us all." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then one soldier lowered his weapon and stepped away from Maven, and another followed, and another, until the traitor stood alone and exposed. "This is not over," Maven snarled. But there was fear in his eyes now. "The Krathian fleet will arrive within hours, and they will burn this world to ash. The Krathian fleet is retreating," Saray's voice announced from the doorway, where she stood with a communication device in hand and a fierce smile on her face. It seems that when their champion fell, their admiral decided that humanity's allies might be more trouble than they were worth. She crossed the room to embrace Valari, then looked at Day One with something like respect. The human made quite an impression. "It seems," she said, "word of his victory is spreading through the hegemony's ranks, and they are wondering what other surprises humanity might have in store." In the chaos that followed, the arrest of Maven, the freeing of the Emperor, the celebrations of the loyalist forces, Valari found a quiet moment to stand before her father, with Day One at her side. "You chose well, daughter," Emperor Thalvex said, looking at the wounded human with new eyes. "This one has proven himself worthy of far more than your consideration." Valari took Day One's hand in hers and faced the gathered court. The same nobles who had witnessed her rejection weeks ago. "I said anyone but the human," she announced, her voice carrying through the crystal halls that were slowly being restored to their former glory. "I was a fool, blinded by pride and prejudice and the arrogance of assumed superiority." She looked at Day One, at his battered face and gentle eyes, at the strength that had nothing to do with muscles or weapons and everything to do with spirit. If fate must intervene to teach a princess humility, she continued, "then let it be known. I am grateful for the lesson." The court erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. But Valari did not care. She pulled Day One forward and kissed him before the entire assembly. A declaration that no words could have made more clearly. "I choose the human," she said when they finally parted. Now and forever. Outside the crystal halls, the sun rose over Ethera Prime, its light catching the floating lanterns that had been released to celebrate the Empire's salvation. And two figures walked together through the palace gardens, their fingers intertwined. "What happens now?" the one asked, and for the first time, Valari heard uncertainty in his voice. "Now," she replied, leaning against him as they watched the dawn paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "We face whatever comes next together." She smiled at the human who had changed everything she thought she knew about the universe. "And something tells me," she added, "that with you beside me, even the impossible may be within reach." They walked on together, a princess and her human, and the galaxy watched in wonder as a new alliance was born from the ashes of prejudice and the fire of unlikely love.